Okay, so as you can see, we are not yet finished with XProc. So you have seen what you can do with XProc, and now Quin is going to show you how we approach implementing the XProc.
All right, can you hear me at the back? Can you hear me at the front? I'm terribly sorry. All right, and you can read that, right? All right, my name's Quin. Some of you know me already, seeing as I've been here before. I'm now independent with delightful computing. But over the last 20 years, almost 30 years, over the last little while, I don't want to think about that, I've done consulting on the side. It was something that my previous employer encouraged, and before then, it was how I made a living. In the last few years, I've had people who wanted XML work doing, and some of them were XSLT shops. And they had things that you might have said, well, let's do a pipeline, let's use XProc. And they said, no, don't want to do that. So I said, all right, what can we do in XSLT? So my goal in this paper then is to bring some of the experiments that I did and say, what kind of XProc stuff can we do in XSLT, and does it make sense, and when? And the TLDR, if that's still a fashionable thing to say, is that some things make a lot of sense and some things make no sense. And it is useful to understand. But XSLT3 and some of the extensions found in the processors, including, of course, Saxon, have really changed what you can do a lot in the last few years, in the last short time. And if you kind of think of the entire workflow that you've got in an organization as some kind of big machine, then one thing we can do is we can just oil the machine a little, make a few things a bit easier, make things work more smoothly. This gets bigger if I stretch it. Yes, that's wonderful. So, to a couple of those clients, I went back and discovered FN Transform could do what they needed, which was to run a sequence of XSLT transformations orchestrated somehow. That's just like an XProc thing to do, but you could also do it in a single style sheet. Now, you could do that in two ways. You could take their style sheets and combine them into one big style sheet. But then you've got maintenance and reuse questions. So don't really want to do that. And there's also a technical reason why you can't always do it, which I'll come to. So the fun thing is with FN Transform is you can invoke another transformation right from within XSLT. And the result happens, and you get it back in, depending on how you're running XSLT, you generally get it back in a map. So, is there anyone here who uses XSLT? Is there anyone here who's never heard of XSLT? Okay. We'll take you to a back alley later. All right. One of the things that did come out, though, was that for quite a lot of stuff that you can do, you can use fewer tools and a simpler environment. And that can be a win, even if what you're doing isn't quite in the design space of one tool. If you only got one tool, sometimes that's a win. You do have to watch, though, that you don't start thinking that you can do everything in the world with XSLT, and you kind of become this workflow machine, that you become the machine. And so this picture is simultaneously a warning, but it's also how some of my clients viewed their first XProc experience. And that's part of why I'm eagerly looking forward to XProc 3, by the way, because some of those difficult parts are really getting eased. There we go. So there's a number of different technical areas that FN transform and the XSLT extensions and the new features make possible. Some of them are obvious, like you can run XSLT, you can run a separate transformation. There's some other areas that come into XProc that you can't so easily do in XSLT. So this list is a mix of just some example features that I'll go through some of them a little bit. So for example, one of the original use cases of XSLT was you had a mixture of XInclude and schema validation and DTD validation, and you wanted to use different schemas and different kinds of validation at different times. And if you want to do that in a standard way with XQuery in the document function, well, you lose, as you can't. There are extensions. There is actually a slightly tricky way of doing it with Saxon. You can set up multiple configurations, right, and call transformations to do things like XInclude. You can have a configuration that says we do XInclude or we do DTD validation or whatever, but it's not very dynamic, as far as I know. Maybe I'm being stared at by the XSLT god, but no, okay. But this kind of thing didn't really fall in. So this kind of use case, stick with XProc.
There are some options on XSL source.
Yeah. There is some stuff you can do, but there's a danger that you'll end up fighting the system if you do this. If you want to do a mix of queries and XSLT, you want to call XQuery, get some stuff out of a database, maybe take some documents, go off and do a web service or something, and go off into the web and fetch something over here, do some XSLT on it, go over here and do a query in a database, combine the results in XSLT. We actually never put an FN query that's parallel to FN transform into the functions and operators spec. I never quite figured out why, but we didn't. But luckily, Saxon has one, and it looks to me like other people would probably support that doing XSLT3, but I didn't actually check that. So you may be able to do that. If you can't, you can always run your query by contacting a web service like the REST interface for XQuery. So you'll have a parsing cost potentially. You're going over a network and you're parsing pointy brackets for the results, but at least you can do it. When I submitted this paper, I mentioned one of the things you can do in XSLT is you can run programs. And because of things like result documents and the EXPath file::write extension, has anyone here encountered EXPath extensions like file::write? Very few. OK, so EXPath is a set of extensions to XPath, but hence to XSLT and XQuery, implemented by Saxon and BaseX, and in fact by XSLTproc and a number of other processors to a greater or lesser extent. So you can read and write files. And in my review, I mentioned that you can write a PERL script, for example, and then run it from XSLT. And a couple of the people said, I'd like to see that. So here's a fragment of XSLT that runs a PERL script. We're missing the, it's in the paper, sorry, we're missing the namespace system : which in Saxon ties to Java. This is very processor specific. Different processors have different ways of calling XPath extension functions and calling into the system. I wanted you just to give you just one example, but every XSLT system that I've encountered has a way to do this, even though it's not always very well documented, and you might have to do a lot of searching. The weird thing here that you might not guess is that I'm doing something with a side effect, and we've heard a number of talks at this conference about the excitement of doing things with side effects in XSLT and how the XSLT fabulous optimizer makes things go really fast by not doing it. Right, so you need to use the side effect, and XSL message is one side effecting thing that makes it happen. And I'm being a bit sneaky there with the, it's actually not necessary in this circumstance, but I'm using the square bracket 2 there. I'm making a sequence, and the first item is the result of this side effecting function, and the second argument is an empty string or an empty sequence. And then I take the second one, and although in this particular example it's not needed, it works if you don't do that. There are other examples where, because the processor can't work out at runtime, compile time, that the first thing isn't whether the first thing's going to return anything or not, it has to evaluate it to know which is the second, how many things are in the sequence before it knows the second. And then we guarantee we get an empty result because, in fact, the return status from a system call is likely to be something other than you might expect. It's not actually the text of running the PERL script. It's something that tells you whether it went successfully. It's likely to be a Boolean on some systems, or it may be an integer telling you what the exit status was or something. But there's an example running a program. So that's an example of something that you might have thought you can only do in XProc and not in XSLT. One of the things that the customer wanted was writing ebooks, EPUB files. And EPUB files are zips. So obviously you can't write a zip in XSLT. That's crazy. You can't do that. So here's some XSLT that does it. Because I'm a crazy kind of guy, right? This is just a fragment. The archive colon is an extension from EXPath. And there's actually several different ways to do it. If you're writing an ebook, you have the problem that the first entry must be uncompressed and the rest should be compressed. I see some people nodding their heads. They've struggled with this. And in fact, there was a Saxon bug that Saxon didn't support doing that unless you updated an archive. But I've since heard that there's other places where there's the same difficulty. So this seems to be a more portable way of doing it than some of the more obvious ways you might choose. The reason I've got alternating values is because archive update takes 2 parallel lists, which is crazy and evil, but that's what it does. Right? And one list is the file name, and the corresponding item in the other list is the contents of the file. So I find it much easier to make one long list, one long sequence, which is file name value, and then split them here. But you could have if you have 2 separate function calls, then you're going to have 2 functions to maintain. That's quite hard. Whereas generating file name and value next to each other in code, you're much less likely to make a mistake. It's also really a good idea to check that your list has an even number of names before doing this and call a fatal error. And the bottom line on the screen, the bottom 2 lines, is creates a directory and writes the final binary archive into somewhere presumably in that directory. I didn't show that here. And returns the value of the first one of those to produce something. And that's actually a place where if you don't put the 1, I was finding sometimes Saxon didn't make the directory. But that could have been some of this stuff was fairly new when I was doing it. So.
We've introduced a Saxon colon do that sort of says, here are side effects, go and do them.
Yes, thank you for reminding me about that. For anyone who didn't hear and for the recording, Mike Kay mentions there's a Saxon colon do, which means you can be more explicit about this. And although it's Saxon specific, at the moment that's not an issue because if you're using a different XSLT processor, you might need to rewrite some of this anyway because it's using extensions. Although I think this particular fragment here is likely to work in other XSLT3 implementations in the future as is. So that's, that's a. On the other hand, everyone else supports Saxon extensions. So when they can. Anyway, there's writing a zip archive. There is a restriction, and you need to understand it because otherwise you will get error messages that will cause you to bang your head against a desk. In XSLT, XSL result document was introduced. This is an XSL instruction, an element, and everything inside it is written out to the file or to the resource in the href. And you can't write to the same thing twice. This kind of Heraclitus mode doesn't work. So, and you can't read from a URL that you've written to. If you call a style sheet with FN transform, I mentioned before you get a map back. And the style sheet that you call, the transformation that you call, doesn't actually write anything out, even if there's result documents. Instead, all the things that you tried to write come back in a map. And it's terribly important that you catch them and write them, because otherwise your XSLT will lose documents, you'll lose information. There is a mitigation of the restriction, though, and the first mitigation is that it only applies to result document. The spec doesn't say anything about extensions such as file::write, and the file spec doesn't say anything about you can't write to the same thing twice. You do have to be careful to make sure there's a dependency. If you want A done before B, then B has to depend on the result of doing A, absent side effecting pragmas or Saxon do or whatever. You can also, when you call FN transform, you can specify an XSLT function, and the XSLT processor will call that function for each file created. What I found is if you run XSLT from within Oxygen, then as I recall, I'm saying this from memory, but as I recall, those functions don't get called. And I think what's going on is Oxygen is interposing in the API so that it can bring the documents up in Windows and you can edit them. But if you run from command line, they do. It might be the other way around, I don't remember, but I know it's different. So I always write XSLT that does both so that you don't lose your data. It's worth noticing, it's also worth thinking that if we could write our own entity resolver in XSLT and register it with the XSLT processor, then we could return an in-memory copy instead of writing something and have another way of working around that restriction that might be more efficient. Okay, so the strategy that I took, I'm taking longer than the strategy that I took was to replace each XProc step with an XSLT function. And you can see here, if you've got an XProc pipeline that does 1, 2, 3, then you do step 1 first. You take the result of that as an argument to step 2, the result of that as an argument to step 3. And in actual fact, in practice, I found it useful to pass an extra map down as a parameter and to simulate variables. So, speaking of variables, there are some complications, and conditional operations in XProc, and plumbing that's anything other than a simple sequence, you end up keeping things in variables in XSLT, which is fine, but there can be memory constraints there, and you ain't doing streaming, right? So let's think a bit about the wider. I want to come back and think a bit about the wider context. This is the guy oiling the machine again. This particular diagram is from a Victorian book, and they're talking about how you have to think of the mind as a machine, and we have to oil it to keep it working. And they thought of the human mind as having vast cogs inside it, just as some people today use an analogy of the mind as being like a computer. And you have to keep your spirit oiled, and then it has instructions on exactly how you should think about everything in order to be a free thinker. All right, so is this stuff a good idea? There's questions around performance, but if performance is a real issue, then you need to go do measuring. We heard some wonderful stuff about measuring from Mike Kay earlier yesterday. And there's no one answer. This technique may actually be faster than XProc. In some circumstances, it may be slower, or it may be about the same. Most likely, it'll be about the same with Calabash. But what really matters is, can you maintain it? Is it readable? And can you fix it when it goes wrong? And can you change it? And those things usually dominate over any kind of performance. And then there's a lot of work going on. We heard about XPath tasks from Adam and Debbie. There's a lot of other work. We've heard about XProc 3. What I wanted to say was that FN transform and the XPath extensions really push the envelope. You can do a lot more than you could. You might be surprised. XSLT has always been a fun language, but it's now even more fun. It's better than ever. But don't go crazy with it. Otherwise, you'll be one of those heads on the cogs. All right, thank you. Questions?
Okay, thank you very much, Liam. So we have plenty of time for questions. So from Jürgen.
Well, frankly, I think that XSLT is just a domain-specific language. It's just made for transformations, especially for push transformations. And in this respect, it's absolutely ingenious. But in contrast to XSLT, XQuery is a fundamental language. It's about mapping information to information. And I'm aware of the fact that 9 out of 10 people in this room, when it's about processing XML, they think of XSLT, but I think it's misguided. And for example, XProc to emulate this with nested flower is absolutely simple, I think, and absolutely obvious. And well, therefore, I really doubt if it's the best point of view, should I replace it by XSLT? I think use XQuery.
Okay, thank you. I think the question that I came in with was I had an XSLT-only workflow for a client. And so saying to them, we're not going to use XProc, which would be ideal for this job. We're going to use XQuery would be a fail. But there is, I think Jim Fuller has done some work. Is Jim here? I can't see him anyway. I think he's done some work on XQuery and XProc implementation, and it's fine. But that's a different question. I'm not trying to replace XProc. Neither am I trying to implement XProc in XSLT. I'm saying, let's explore some of the things that you might think of as XProc only that you can actually do in XSLT. If I had an hour to talk, I would probably also say EXPath, as I mentioned earlier, is also available in XQuery implementations. So you can do a lot of this in both and explore a lot more of the synergy. Any more?
Hi, Liam. Yeah, Norm Walsh. I will try to be brief. The XQuery step is no longer optional in 3.0 as of about 48 hours ago. The second time that optional steps, the fact that steps are optional has come up. So if optionality of steps is a concern for folks, I'd be interested in talking about that. Specifically to what you did, which I thought was very, very cool. If your argument against XProc 1 was that the syntax was tortured, I'm not sure the XSLT examples are clearly superior. And finally, just in passing, I'd be interested in talking to anybody about the resolver trick. My XProc implementation uses a resolver that caches the results so that you can do those sorts of things. But that hasn't made it into XProc as a standard, and I'm not convinced that it is without drawbacks, but I'd be happy to talk about it. Thank you, Liam.
Yeah, thank you. With XProc 1, when I did an XProc 1 pipeline for a client, there were very few resources. It was hard to learn from the spec. It was hard to know whether something was a bug in an implementation, a bug in the way the implementation was being used. So there were a lot of difficulties. But FN transform didn't exist then either. Is the syntax I'm showing better or worse? If you're an XSLT person, you may find it better, you may not, I don't know. But I'm not saying it's a general replacement. I'm saying I come to praise XProc, not to bury it. But I say that without irony. What I want to see is an XProc 3 that has some of the difficulties eased out, and that's obviously what's happening from the earlier talk.
There's a question from Mike K.
Addressing a couple of the comments there, XSLT is a domain-specific language. Yes, it's a language with a very strong focus on one particular task. What happens is when there's never a task that fits entirely within the scope of the domain of one language. And if XSLT is what you've got in your kit bag, and if it's doing 90% of the job really well, then it's very, very tempting to use the skills and resources and tools that you've got open on your desk to do the other bits of the job as well, which is why we added math functions, even though it's not primarily a language for doing math computation. Why we added data structures, why we added all sorts of things, because you just don't want to choose a domain-specific language and then find that you're constrained by it. You want to move outside the box. And eventually, if you move too far from its roots, you find you're using the wrong tool for the job. But if 90% of what you're doing is within the scope of what the language was designed for, then you're doing the right thing by stretching it a little bit beyond that core.
Yeah, agree 100%. Thank you.
Okay, do we have more questions? Oh, there is one from Alan. Probably this will be the last question.
All right, so we're talking about domain-specific languages. Someone was talking
sorry,
about
I
that
can't hear
yesterday.
Speak up, please.
Pardon me. We're talking about domain-specific languages. Again, someone was speaking about that yesterday. There was I just wanted to mention that on the Wikipedia page, there is a mention of XSLT as being originally a domain-specific language, but that it had become so generalized that it could be considered a general programming language at this point. So I think that Wikipedia is an objective point for all of us. So I just thought I would point that out. And Hans-Jürgen is a guy I love and who's helped me a lot, but we disagree on XProc and XSLT and about which one is the superior one. And we've had many discussions about that. So I just thought I would mention that. Thank you.
And it has to be about fitness to task. And fitness to task has to include the wider context, which is why I wanted to include this picture here, because it's not just the task I'm doing, it's the task I'm doing in the organization in which I'm doing it, and in the context of the past and the future, maintaining it and the skills we've got and the people we've got. There's not usually a best overall, right? It doesn't work that way. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you again. We just beat the marker.